Tsar Nicholas abdicated on March 15th, 1917. So the peasants hated the Tsar, everybody hated the Tsar. He was ineffectual, treated the people, pretty poorly and kept the wealth to himself, and that fostered a lot of socialism and communism type activities. And once he was abdicated, a provisional government was formed by a group of moderate socialists, led by a man named Kerensky. So that was on March 1917. All along, though, the war's been going on, and finally the U.S. gets sucked into it. Just a month later, on April 6, 1917, basically the Zimmerman telegram promising Mexico some of the U.S. when the U.S. would lose to Germany. That's what sort of triggered it. And eventually the pacifists lost the fight for staying out of World War I. And as a result, we needed to form an army. We declared war that we had at that time, the sixth largest standing army in the world, right after Belgium. Belgium was number 5 at the time. We had 125,000 men in the U.S. Army at the time. So the next thing is institute the draft. So a month later, June 5th, 1917, 10.5 million were registered for the draft on a single day. Eventually, the number would climb to 23 million, out of which 4 million actually were inducted, 2 million of which made it over to Europe, and only half of those before Armistice Day. So rough numbers, that was our involvement, but we had to ramp up and train these guys first, because there's no way 125,000 guys would do much of anything. So June 5th, and these records, any genealogist knows about the draft registration records available on Ancestry. Those 29 million, or 23 million cards are there, but 10.5 million of them were filled out on June 5th. That was like a civic holiday that day. In the Detroit area, all the factories closed down. Ford Motor closed. And Henry Ford said, if you were between the ages of 21 and 31, which was the requirement for this registration, you better have your receipt in hand when you come back the next day, otherwise your job is gone. But men turned up, back in those days in the cities, you would vote at a shed that they would drag out to the street corner. That was how you would cast your vote. So basically this is like a voting day, except that there were long lines for men to register for the draft. Citizens came out and gave them pictures of lemonade, because apparently it was pretty hot that day. Also, there was threats of violence, because there was a large number of socialists clamoring for us to stay out of the war. And they were threatening to disrupt the registration process, but the Spanish American vets said, no, you're not. We'll guard the polling places. And they did. One place where there was some violence, the registration day was up in Keweenaw Peninsula. And it wasn't anything of significance, but it was the only one I was able to find that happened in Michigan. Now, the first registration is in June for the draft. In August, they have Camp Custer activated. They built that from scratch, because you had to have a place to train all these 10 million guys. So they built cantonments, or training camps, in regional locations. So one in the Great Lakes region was built by Battle Creek, and it was called Camp Custer. And that 85th Division was also named after Custer. It was called the Custer Division. So if you see a shoulder patch that says CD, much like the old civil defense logo, that was originally the logo that was used for the Custer Division. So they were formed on August 25th and included 4 infantry regiments, the 337th, 338th, 339th, and 340th. That was the 4 regiments, infantry regiments, to the division. Being the fact that most of the men that filled out the 339th came from the Detroit area, the officers said, let's adopt the nickname Detroit Zone. So they were originally called Detroit Zone, and as they went through the training process, the Detroit papers followed them and reported back weekly on what was happening out at Camp Custer. Continuing the timeline, while they were filling up Camp Custer, the Bolsheviks, the more or I should say less moderate, communist, socialist, overthrew the Kerensky provisional government. So this is their famous October Revolution, but that's according to the old calendar. According to our calendar, that happened on November 7th, 1917. So Russia is now, because the Bolsheviks, they're going to exit the war and sue for peace. And you can see the Port Huron Times Herald headlines here. Beneath there, Civil War now facing Russia. So it was already starting to happen. The whites and the reds were already starting their civil war, and this is November 1917. True to their word, Bolsheviks got out of the war. It took a few months, but they basically gave up large amounts of territory to the Germans by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is in today's Ukraine. And that was signed on March 3rd, 1918. So all the fighting on the Eastern Front, that large front there on the right side of that map that I showed you, officially came to the end. And the big concern now is that with springtime turning into summer, the fighting activity always ramps up because you can't do much when it's really muddy and cold. So the worry was from the Allies, from the British in particular, and also the French, is that Germany now is going to take all their troops and divisions away from the Eastern Front and send them to the Western Front. And they would overwhelm the Allies because the Americans were just starting to trickle in and not ready to fight yet. So that was the big concern that came out of the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Custer then, eventually the 85th Division completed their training, and over a full week, 70 trains over 7 days, moved those 30,000 men from Battle Creek to New York City. So Camp Custer was on the move during the week, or the 85th Custer Division, I should say, was on the move during the week of July 11th. At the same time, they're moving to the embarkation points in Brooklyn to head over to Europe. President Wilson finally succumbs to the pressure that he was getting from the British and the French to intervene in Russia on the pretext of basically convincing the Germans that they see the Allies are coming to resurrect the fighting on the Eastern Front, and they would be moving those divisions to the Western Front. Wilson didn't want men fighting, so he agreed to a limited number of men to go, basically to protect military supplies in Archangel that the Allies had sent to the Tsar's army to keep them from falling into the hands of the Bolsheviks and the Germans. There was also a bunch of prisoners that had been released once the Bolsheviks dropped out of the war. They were trying to make their way back to fight on the Western Front, mostly from what's now the Czechoslovakia region, but they couldn't go directly to France. They had to go across Russia and Siberia to the Pacific Ocean and get on ships and come around South Africa to get to France. And so the idea was, well, let's take them out through Archangel. So that was another idea of sending Allied troops to Archangel. And of course, keep German army divisions at the Eastern Front. So that was his rationalization. He expressly said he didn't want our men fighting. But he forgot that he previously signed an agreement with the British that said any operations in the Arctic regions would be under the command of the British. So a week later, after Wilson signs this agreement to send a limited number of troops, John Pershing detaches 4,750 men. This is the first group out of the 85th Division to form what became known as the American North Russia Expeditionary Force. He didn't specifically pick the 339th, but they were picked for whatever reasons while they were at sea, while they were transiting. So these were the only American soldiers that were en route to France. Pershing didn't want to take any Americans away from the Western Front who were already there, so these were the prime targets for going to Russia. And they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's how they ended up picking the 339th there's a lot of stories that say, well, they picked them because they were Michigan men, they were used to cold, and so on. That may be true, but it really just had nothing to do. There were no other potential candidates out there other than the 85th Division. So when the 339th and the 310th Engineers arrived in Liverpool, they sent them to a separate camp in England, and the rest of the balance of the 85th Division went over to France. 3 weeks of training, they took away the 339th and 310th uniforms and weapons, gave them all new stuff, British issued heavy wool uniforms. And this was the hottest summer England had in years. Marched them up and down all the country lanes, and after 3 weeks sent them up to Newcastle, where they boarded those 3 troop ships. And the next stop would be Archangel, where they arrived on September 5th. 2 of those 3 ships, though, had just disembarked soldiers who had come down with a strange case of influenza. They didn't know that, but a few days out before they got to Russia, men started dropping like flies with the Spanish influenza. If you're on that 3rd ship, the Somali, they did not get infected. So by the time they arrive on September 5th, they're already losing men. That first month, 60 men died, and that prompted the officials in Pershing's office to send 500 men from the 85th who went to France up to Archangel as replacements. So it was a big impact getting off on the wrong foot with the Spanish influenza. So when the American officers disembark on September 5th, the British tell them, well, you're under our command now, and all of a sudden now we've got mission creep, what we call it today mission creep. The original objective is no longer what you thought it was. The British commander says, you're going to go down and chase the Boers, because we were fleeing to the south along the railroad front and upriver along the river. So here's Archangel. That's the railroad that connects to Moscow. And this is the Dvina River, which connects to Kotlas, where they hoped to connect with the Czech Legion and bring them out that way. So this is the plan for the British. They thought that between the small number of Americans, small number of British, they could raise 15,000 local men to fight alongside them and have a 30,000 man army to fight the Bolsheviks. Well, it's just like in our American Civil War, sometimes the North and the South, they were cousins fighting cousins. And you had the same situation here. They could not get any volunteers from the local Archangel region to join them in this operation. So the fighting was basically left to the Americans and the British. The orange area here is the extent of the maximum amount of areas that they captured back from the Bolsheviks. That's the high point, which occurred in January of 1919. In addition to the British, there were also French troops up there and a limited number of white Russian troops. And they were all fighting against the Bolsheviks. So they landed in September. They spent October chasing the Bolsheviks, the rest of September and October chasing the Bolsheviks, and then October 20th, the first heavy snows fell. A new general had come in to replace the existing General Poole, British general. He saw the folly of General Poole's objectives. He knew that they would never get to Kotlas, and he knew they would never get to Moscow on their railroad. So he gave orders in the last week of October for everybody to dig in and hold your position for the winter. Well, October 20th, they're digging in. By November 11th, they're dug in, going to stay there for the winter, keep the Bolsheviks from reclaiming the land that we had taken from them. But all of a sudden, they get telegraph news from Archangel that the armistice is signed and the fighting's ended on the Western Front. But it didn't end there. And it didn't end there because the Bolsheviks says, hey, we didn't sign no armistice. We already signed our peace agreement with Germany, and we're fighting the Allied invaders. So the armistice meant nothing to the Bolsheviks, and as our men quickly found out, it didn't mean anything for them either. They were to continue fighting throughout the winter of 1918-1919. Some of the major battles, I'm not going to get a lot of detail, because some of it was just small skirmishes, but the major battles were all along the railroad front as they pushed the Bolsheviks to the south. That occurred up till the end of October. Along the Divinia Riverfront, the first major battle coincidentally happened on November 11th at Tulgas, a small little village, fishing village. The furthest that the Americans made it up along the Divinia Riverfront were a couple of small towns called Ninjagora and Visarkagora. They held those until the Bolsheviks mounted a counterattack on January 19th. They went on the offensive. Up till then, they'd been waiting to see just how many foreign troops were coming. They had the luxury of time. They knew the countryside better than we did. And they also knew that by November, the ports would be frozen in and these guys would have no way out. So once they saw that that was it, roughly 10,000 British and American troops, they decided to go on the offensive once the swamps froze. So beginning of January 19th, a lot of the Americans were retreating along the riverfront. The final major battle was on the Onega front in a town called Bolshevizerki, and that ended in a draw, mainly because the temperatures came above freezing, and both sides realized that the frozen pass that they were using to move artillery and men would soon be a swamp. So both parties retreated, because you had, the weather was the biggest factor really in how they fought and where they fought. Here's some scenes of what Archangel looked like in 1918. You see the three spires there. That's the cathedral, Russian Orthodox cathedral, dedicated to St. Michael the Archangel, after which the town was named. You see some ports, cranes over here, but the main seaport was on the opposite side of the Divinia River, where they had large warehouses, and that was where the railroad began to the south. There were no bridges over the river, no railroad bridges, no nothing, so the major port was actually on the opposite side of the river. They had a streetcar line that ran up and down the main drag. As soon as the men got off, the streetcar workers, our men got off on September 5th, the streetcar workers went on strike, so the British said to the American officers, have you got any streetcar men in your ranks? So they found some men who had worked for the Detroit United Railway and put them to work as strike breakers. After a few days, they broke the strike and then they went back to their union. So here's the Allied headquarters was in this building. You can see the streetcar and the tracks. And that's a rear view of a droshky, which is the type of wheeled cart which would be turned into a sled in the wintertime, pulled by relatively small Russian ponies. But that was during the winter, that was the main mode of getting things to our soldiers at the front lines. A lot of the equipment that were given by the British really was inadequate, so a lot of the men made private purchases of their own for gloves and boots. So the local economy was spurred by our arrival. 310th Engineers was given the task of creating landing zones for what became the Royal Air Force. You can barely see the biplane there. And the big job was keeping the weight of the snow from sagging and collapsing the tents. So that was the 310th Engineers' job, to make the landing areas and keep the Royal Air Force flying. As I mentioned earlier, there were no bridges over the Divinia River, so the Laplanders would move in during the wintertime and bring their reindeer with them, because their reindeer are not native to the Archangel region, and they would provide reindeer-powered taxi cabs across the frozen river. This is pictures taken of the railroad front on November 15th. You can see the snow is already pretty heavy. The Bolsheviks took all the good rolling stock and engines and left behind broken down equipment, which the engineers were able to refurbish. This behind all these guys is a wood burning locomotive. Everything worked off of wood. Wood was plentiful, coal was not. So they got it working, and the men on that were not at the front lines, but were held in reserve, they would stay in these boxcars to stay out of the cold. They had pretty good, nice warm boxcars. They weren't sleeping on the ground, unlike the men at the very front lines of the railroad. Here's some of the droshkis in work, taking equipment to men on the railroad front. This was taken in July of 1918. There's a blockhouse built by the 310th Engineers. They ran the sawmill in Archangel and sent the wood down the railroad and up the river to other engineers then that would build the blockhouses and get machine gun emplacements and things like that. The picture you see there was taken on the morning after the coldest night so far. According to the photographer's caption, it went down to 40 below the night before. This unfortunate fellow was working at sentry duty that day. The losses, we had 152 killed in action or died from wounds received in action. These numbers are kind of outdated. I think we found better numbers now, like 80. 72 died from disease, mostly the Spanish flu. 7 died, 6 of them from accidents, 1 from a suicide. And the number I saw in the newspapers was 305 wounded who would have received the wound chevron to wear on their uniforms. The Purple Heart had been discontinued and wasn't reinstated until 1933, at which time a lot of foreigners then applied to get their Purple Heart. Back home on the home front, everybody's now finally getting letters back from their sons in North Russia. Between the censoring and the slow movement of mail, they generally get the letters about 6 weeks later. But by February, it was pretty clear their sons were stuck up there. So they started clamoring, writing letters to the newspapers, the parents were, and petitioning Congress to bring them in. So there were meetings in Grand Rapids and Detroit, first week of February 1919. And they circulated petitions asking Congress to get our boys home. The Army finally, the War Department finally made an announcement the third week of February saying they'd be brought back at the earliest possible time. They didn't put a date on it, but they knew full well that the Tavinia River was frozen solid and they couldn't get out until the middle of May at the earliest, because that's when the ice typically breaks up. So it took a lot of public opinion to raise the consciousness of some of the congressmen, and particularly people in the rest of the country, that we still have U.S. Army soldiers fighting in Europe. Because by this time, a lot of the guys on the Western Front were already home. Finally, the weather broke. Started in April, by the end of May. The snow was pretty much gone, the rivers free of ice. They celebrated Memorial Day, May 30th. Back then it was always May 30th, not on the last Monday of May. And so this photo was taken at the Allied Cemetery with a bunch of dignitaries and officers on the reviewing stand here, and other officers and troops from all the other nations have been there. Another photo here, showing, taken at the time that they did the rifle volley salute. You can see the gun smoke. You can see a British Union Jack there. These are fresh graves with the crosses at the front, and they're heaped with evergreen boughs. And this was in the very outskirts of Archangel at this time. Today it's surrounded by apartment buildings and other things. I'll show you a photo of what it looks like today. The first ship left with Americans heading back to France was the first stop. They left the 3rd of June, and the same day they left, the telegram received an Archangel from Paris authorizing them to wear a polar bear patch on their shoulder insignia. But it was too late for that first boat load. They knew that that's what they had asked for, and they knew it hadn't been made official. So as they were arriving just a day out of Brest, France, where there was an American camp, they decided they would try and make their own polar bear patches, but they didn't have a good artist on board. The first attempts, it didn't look good. Nobody wanted to wear it. It was a scrawny looking polar bear. So one of the officers had the bright idea of coming up with the patch that you see over here on my grandfather's shoulder. He was aboard that first ship. This company was the first out. And that's an NR with the leg of the N superimposed on the left side of the R. standing for North Russia. Time was of the essence, so everybody agreed, yeah, that looks pretty natty. Make them. So tailors aboard the ship made up enough for the men to wear on their shoulders. They marched from the port and dressed up to the U.S. Army encampment. All the equipment was turned in, they were given all new equipment and cleaned up, deloused. They stayed a few days, had a company picture taken, and then sailed for home. So the first Polar Bears that came back were wearing the NR. They arrived on trains the evening of July 3rd. The citizens of Detroit had planned, and had been watching the newspapers, all the reports of this first group coming back. So, morning of 4th, American troops boarded steamers that took them to Belle Isle, and when they disembarked on the dock there, this is what they saw, everybody with banners and flags waiting to greet them arriving home. And you can see the polar bears up there, different looking polar bears than what you see on the badges, but they were improvising as they went along. The men marched to tents that were marked with their company letters, and then that's where they met up with their family members. For the presentation here today, I went through with the help of Katie, and we identified men that we knew from this area who had served in North Russia. This is not an all-inclusive list, we probably missed a few. We tried to look at the townships that touch Rockford, including Rockford. So, fellow here, Charles Putnam, Applegate was a mailing address, but he was right on the township line, 500 feet away, so I included him. Norman Lemke from Round City, Charles Caston from Quebec, and Katie's looked up to find out where these guys are buried. For example, here this guy's in the Musty Township Cemetery in Quebec. Even though Lemke was from Round City, he's buried in Imlay City, and he's buried in Croswell. Joe Dombrowski's buried in Emmett, which is where he was from. Four guys that lived at one time or another in Melvin, and we're not claiming that these guys were born in these locations or that they died there, but we know at one time they lived there, either before or after their military service. So we have four guys from Melvin: Russell Welch, buried here in Yale; Edward Hammond, buried in Fort Gratiot Township; Mike Clayton in Melvin, buried in Melvin, as is Harold DeMurray. They were both from company age, both buried in Fairburn Cemetery. Peck, we've got three guys that were associated with Peck. Elmer Rose, buried up north further in Twining. George Griggs, buried in Peck, and Stephen McClure, buried in Port Huron. And last but not least, Yale. George Smith, he's buried down in Whitechapel. He was wounded and died of his wounds on the 20th. He was wounded during the Bolshevik attacks when they forced the Americans back towards Arkansas. So he's the only one on this list that died in battle, and he's one of the 56 that are buried around the Whitechapel Porter line in Troy, Michigan. Edward Mullaney came back home, and a couple years later, in 1922, he was shot by a female acquaintance and died of his wounds. And I sent Bud the newspaper clippings I found on that. Katie brought that to my attention. she found a lot of good stuff because she's building adding illustrations to the finder grave site. So good stuff like that. We made sure we didn't lose track of. His female acquaintance was acquitted. So I'll leave it at that. You can read the newspaper clippings. John Thompson, buried in Avoca, but he was originally from Yale, and Grover Wiley, buried here in Yale in the cemetery. So it's about 12 or 13 of the men here from this area. And you'll find them all throughout the thumb. Most of the men in the 339th were from southeast Michigan, but predominantly from Detroit and the Wayne, Oklahoma, Macomb area. The 310th Engineers, there were three companies, Company A, Company B, and Company C. They were mostly from outstate Michigan. Engineers, being typically the guys that would gravitate to that, would be the guys that were outdoor workers, worked in lumber camps or stuff like that, and knew how to work sawmills and build bridges and things like that. So 310th Engineers, they're scattered more widely around Michigan as opposed to 339. Now, when the men were returned in 1919, they brought in a Graves registration group to bring back the dead. But because the Bolshevik were on the move, a lot of the initial burial places of the men that died were now behind enemy lines. So in 1919, they were only able to get back about half of the 230. And then subsequently, in 1929, a mission was conducted to go and find the remaining men. They were able to get 86 more back. In 1934, to recognize the fact that the U.S. and the USSR finally established diplomatic relations, the Russians invited us to come in and find some more, and they brought back 14 more. So the numbers, the math is off maybe one or two, but by my calculations, there's still 23 men whose remains are still in Russia. The ones that are not bolted, they drowned in action, so they will never find their remains. They got swept downstream. But the others, we know that they were initially buried in a temporary graveyard close to where they fell. And in those other 1929, 1934 missions, when they went back using the instructions they had, they couldn't find them. So who knows? The paperwork on who was buried when and where was really, really amateurish, because they just weren't prepared for this. They were going up just to guard material. They didn't have graves registration groups with them and other people to keep track of all this. So there's still 23 by my count, and you might be able to find 21 of them if we had the time or the effort. With new technology, ground penetrating radar, it's a possibility. I have a friend up there who has recovered Bolshevik bodies at the railroad's front, and also recovered a British body. So he and his team know how to do that. We were talking about trying to do something and find funding from the government back in 2019. But then I was contacted by a group operating a museum out of New Jersey. It sounded kind of fishy, but he says, no, we just started up, and that's why we don't have websites and everything. So they said they were going over, they had experts, they knew where these 23 guys were buried, and they were going to find them and bring them back. So I asked them, well, do you know where they were initially buried? No, but we got a guy over there who knows. Well, I thought it wasn't my buddy who might have known. It was some other guy that was more of a World War II expert. So then I said, we debated amongst ourselves, Florida River Memorial Association group, whether we ought to share the names that I had developed. So we gave him his names. And then he says, yeah, we'll be going in. We already got all our clearances, we got our passports, we got our visas, and we'll be there 2 weeks. And I said, not if you're going to find these guys. I made a map, a Google map, and showed them. When you drew a circle around all these initial burial locations, it's an area the size of the state of New Jersey. So these guys knew nothing of what they were trying to do. So we cut off all ties with them, and nothing ever happened. But the straw that broke the camel's back was when they sent me a letter addressed to Vladimir Putin, thanking him for putting resources to go find our polar bear soldiers. And I said, I ain't signing this. I'll get into this a little more if I've got time, because this is the start of what you're hearing on the Russian propaganda relative to the Ukraine special operations that was already happening in 2019. Like I said, they weren't able to bring them all home. We got 86 bodies in 1929, and 14 in 1934. The picture here is some of the dead that were brought back in 1919 that were going to be buried locally. So they were held overnight in a convention hall in Detroit. So that's what that picture is. But after the 1929 recovery mission. They brought them back in November of '29, and the polar bear veterans raised funds to create a monument of a polar bear that was dedicated on Memorial Day 1930, at the same time of which 45 of those 86 bodies were buried at Whitechapel. And that's the parents of one of them. Scocelis is their last name, S-C-O-E-A-S. Eastern European immigrants, if you can't tell. As were many of them that went over there. There were one man that went over there and met up with his mom in Russia. Recent Russian. Some of them brought back Russian war guns. And there were at least one or two orphans who were adopted as mascots that were brought back later on to the U.S. So that's the polar bear monument. It was dedicated on Memorial Day 1930. Every year since then, there's been a Memorial Day ceremony there. The last of the polar bears passed away in the middle 80s, but they were just down to a few. So Memorial Day service, basically in the early and mid 80s, which is 4 or 5 people, but we formed our group and we've got a pretty good mailing list. Fortunately, a lot of relatives still live in this area. I estimate that there's probably 250,000 great-grandchildren reported living in Michigan, just doing some rough math. So they're everywhere, and a lot of them don't even know their great-grandfather was a polar bear, but they're finding Find a Grave, because Katie Markson with the Polar Bear Virtual Cemetery indicator, and she's getting email from someone, I didn't know he was a polar bear. So when I did my family tree, I found 2 more polar bears. A distant cousin on my dad's side, and a less distant cousin on my mom's side. So if you had family that had immigrated here prior to 1980, but if you had a male born roughly 1893, 1895, chances are pretty good he ended up either in Northwestern, 339, or in the Red Arrow Division, which is most of the guys from the west side of the state. But those are the 2 main groups from Michigan that ended up with men over in Europe. So like I say, this is a more recent photo of our Polar Bear Memorial Association Memorial Day service. We draw a couple hundred. 20 years ago, when I first got involved, maybe 100, maybe not even that. So the word spreads and we get more people each year. Typical weather. If you're interested in pursuing and finding more about the Michigan Heroes Museum, up in Fragmuth, it's got the stories of 50 polar bears. The story is when the polar bears donated a uniform, a photo of them, and their medals, and the backstory, so we know their name, rank, and serial number. So that's the equivalent of the story. So we've got about 50 of them that were donated back before those men passed away. You've got Bentley, who's got a lot of textual archives, letters, books, photo albums, things like that. And almost 100% of that has been digitized, and you can get it at that website, and it's free. So we've got a lot of archival information from there. The Sandusky District Library's got a digital collection that came from a polar bear named Maurice Erickson, and that's free and available online. And I've got a website that I've created where you can find links to these places and a lot of other polar bear resources. That's a view of just 4 of the display cases of polar bears at the Michigan Heroes Museum. We've got a display case here with artifacts like revolvers and medals and timepieces and shrapnel, stuff like that. So we usually have about 10 of the polar bears on display at any one time in this gallery. The rest are in storage and we rotate. And the museum's located on White Street, about a quarter-mile north of Bronner's. As I mentioned, I got some more photos here. These are much more recent. I had the opportunity to go to Archangel in August of 2018. Pen pal out there have been telling me for years, you really need to come visit. I'll show you where your grandfather fought. So Finally went in 2018, which happened to be the centennial year. I arrived on August 2nd, 100 years to the day that the British arrived in Archangel aboard several warships. Alexei took me down to verse 44-45, which was the front lines during the winter on the railroad front. There was no station there. If you wanted to step off and onto a platform, you would then have to walk a mile and a half, but he had the engineer drop us off. The first step is a doozy. Not so bad getting off, but try getting back on. You gotta pack a backpack. That's a trench, still visible 100 years later. These trees have all grown up since then because they would need a clear field of fire. But these were trenches they used to move from machine gun emplacement to machine gun emplacement. And if you dig down further, it's filled with leaves and debris, vegetation. Dig down far enough, you'll find thousands of cartridges, brass cartridges. I'm standing in that former trench, just to give you a little perspective. To the right of this young lady used to be a blockhouse, a wooden blockhouse. But underneath the blockhouse was like a little dugout, protection, particularly if the upper part of the blockhouse was hit by artillery shell, you could still get protection by going underneath the floor. And that's what she's doing. She's going beneath there. And this is what it looks like. Oh, wow. Still preserved. And that was built by 3 Temple engineers. That's my friend Alexei with his metal detector. Since this was an area of constant bombardment over the entire winter, there was shrapnel everywhere. So he just found a piece of shrapnel and he's giving it to the son of a polar bear, not a grandson, John Yap. His father was from Paducah, Kentucky, came back, ran a store, got married late in life, and his father was like 55 or 60 when he was born. So he's my age, but the son, actual son, and able to make the trip in 2018. He joined up with me when he found out I was going. And again, here's Alexei now on the side here with John using the metal detector. And that was my translator, I hired, Virginia, very fluent. She could translate on the fly, you didn't even have to stop. And that's some buildings in the background here that Alexei and his team built at shelter. So this was like his base camp. And he would find artifacts and then take them back to Archangel where he has a small private museum. His day job is a publisher, so you know, I'm sure you're familiar with Our Magazine, or in the glossy magazines you see in the back pocket on airliners. He publishes one like that in Archangel. And once a year he puts an article in there about the Bolshevik and the Allied interventions. So he's very knowledgeable on what's happening there. This photo I took in my former museum built during the days of the Soviet Union, which has now been abandoned. It was a prisoner of war camp built by the British, about 20 miles north of Archangel. And you can see they were telling the stories of the Bolsheviks, the stories of the Bolsheviks who were imprisoned there. And this is a general map showing the region. School kids, every year they would take the school kids out there and indoctrinate them what had happened here. Still a lot of dissension as to who actually built that POW camp. But certainly it was put to good use after the Allies left in the early 20s and during the Stalin era. A lot of political prisoners were kept there. So Alexei and his team have moved on from the railroad front, and now they're rehabbing this. This is the Allied Cemetery in Archangel. I showed the photos that were taken on Memorial Day. That's what it looks like today. The way there's so many gaps in there is because a lot of those graves were removed, including the Americans that have been buried there. It's still owned and maintained by the British War Graves Commission. They send money to a local company up there that maintains this. But during the Soviet Union era, in the 70s, it was all overgrown. and it was just filled with trash. So it's 100% better than it had been. That's Alexi's private museum with some of his artifacts.
That's cool.
And that's Alexi and me. That was taking the day I was leaving. And that was a nice Arctic sunset. You get some beautiful sunsets in August up there. Basically, the view from my hotel, I was right across the street from there. And the hotel is the nicest hotels you get. They're all right. No air conditioning, no screens on the windows. They don't get tourists up there. They get some business and then come up there, but that's just the way it is. You only need windows and screens for 2 weeks a year, so why bother putting them in? And it was like $80 a night. 4 of us ate for $85 equivalent US. That included drinks and dinner at a top-notch restaurant. Now, photos taken this summer. Alexi and his team have turned this into a military history. And they named it after the Yurovesky Regiment. And that was the regiment that our guys were fighting and pushing down the railroad line in September and October of 1918. And we basically decimated them. They had to be withdrawn and replaced with better troops, and they got regrouped and they put into reserve. So they named it after the Yurovesky Regiment. This is translated, this is what you see. This is a railroad station. The name of the station is the Yurovesky Frontier. That's in Cyrillic, and this is in Latin, Russian. It says the same thing. So this is all new. They just built it this summer. There's a wooden tank replica in the background, machine gun, I don't know what you call them, good barbed wire, not machine gun, barbed wire. There's no real barbed wire, he's already taken all that over the years. A wooden replica of an artillery piece. That's the platform they built with a little shelter. Somebody made tree trunks and turned them into Bolshevik soldiers for little displays. This is the boardwalks they built, and then they've got, that's a U.S. Army Signal Corps photo of an airplane that crashed nearby. So they tell the story of what happened. So when people come through and visit this military history park, they can do it self-guided. Got a little dome there where they can eat on picnic benches. And this is a famous Russian figure from the USSR days. He was a patriot, a young boy, sounded the alarm and took up arms, and he still got his newspapers under his arm. Alexi sent me a ceramic figurine of the little kid. So now it's more life-size. So I recognize him immediately when he sent me the photo. He had built a Russian Orthodox chapel there among the buildings of his base camp. So as they would find Bolshevik bodies, they would be buried in here. And it's been consecrated by the Russian Orthodox bishop, the Markings. A replica of the, I think it was in Newport, I'm not sure which, but the Bolsheviks had planes too. So they had a wooden replica of the bridge here. There's a nice walking path, so you don't have to walk up and down the marshy hills. So they put a lot of time and money in there. And that money is obviously not his money, it's coming from the presidential administration, which is the name of Vladimir Putin's presidential administration. When I was there, I mentioned about that front. There was a museum in New Jersey. The guy that was the head of it, I finally found their corporation papers. He's a Russian national. And they want me to sign a letter thanking Putin. So, you know, they were getting their money from Russia. And I'm sure Alexi's getting money also from the Putin administration. The story they're telling is slightly different than what the history books tell. When I was there in 2018, I noticed it. I was interviewed for local TV, and then they put the interview up on a webpage. And I thought it was a translation error, but they're saying boldly that the Allied interventionists caused the Russian Civil War. The fact that we came and intervened caused the Russian Civil War. Facts are, no, the whites and the reds were already fighting. We made a long bid on being up there, but we certainly weren't the cause. So that's the pitch, that's what everybody's hearing. When we come here to the Military History Park, I'm sure you're hearing that as well. It's just a spin that they're trying to put on, it says Russia's strong, you know, and this is the history, and they've done the same thing with the World War II history in Western Ukraine. It's a fact that when the Germans came through Ukraine, some of the Ukrainians sided with the Germans. But 90% of them sided with the Russians and fought with the Russians. Well, that is why Putin calls the Ukrainians Nazis. Because of this little historical fact that, yeah, a small group did fight with the Nazis and eventually got wiped out. But he's painting with a broad brush and calling all Ukrainians Nazis because of that little history fact. There we are. When I was up there, the other interesting thing was I'm watching the equivalent of CNN News 24-hour cable channel. And the U.S. had just announced another round of economic sanctions against the Russians. And so the news shows us the talking head talking about, in the background, the B-roll footage, U.S. Army tanks and U.S. Army soldiers racing across an open field. And this was not military sanctions. It had nothing to do with the U.S. Army, but that's the image, that's the thought that they're planting in everybody's mind. You know, again, it's an us versus them thing. So, now, in retrospect, I can see all this as all being a build-up to what eventually became the invasion of Ukraine. So that's my story. You got any questions? Yeah.
So, what is the actual real reason they were called the polar bears? Because I've heard different stories about polar bears.
They were pulled, they had like a vote before they left. Because they were all pulled out of the field and brought back to Archangel in May. And so they wanted an insignia, and so somebody suggested that and a few others, and the vote was taken. They said, we want to be known as polar bears. So the cable was sent to Pershing's office in Paris to get approval. And that, by the time the approval came back, that first ship had already sailed. But it was a popular opinion just to designate that, I served in the Arctic. That's what I got on
Every now, oh, sorry.
that. Go ahead.
You see, guys dressed in all white.
Out there?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was snow camouflage, the white capes. The Bolsheviks used them to great effect, but because the British were in charge of the quartermastering things, they put them on for the motion picture camera guys, but they didn't wear them that often. Yes.